invite you to open up in your Bibles to Proverbs, the 6th chapter. Proverbs chapter 6, if you would go ahead and open up to that. And once you do that, you can sit back and relax because we are not going to leave the book of Proverbs for the entirety of this lesson until the very end. We'll finish in Romans chapter 12, but we're going to spend most of the sermon in the book of Proverbs. We'll kind of bounce around quite a bit throughout the course of that book, look at different things that Solomon has to say, all centered around one central theme that kind of goes with our theme for the entire year, which is about vision, which is about setting goals, which is about pushing towards those goals. That's kind of what our vision is for the year. Before I get to that, though, I have to tell you this really weird story about a show that my dad showed me probably a couple months ago. We were sitting around at his house, and I don't remember who was there. It was me and Melina and the kids. I think Russell may have been there. And Dad all of a sudden just popped off. He said, "Have you ever heard of the show called Pain Kings?" Show of hands. Anybody ever heard of that show, Pain Kings? That's exactly the type of people I thought would have been interested in the show, Pain Kings. If you're not familiar with this show, what it essentially is you have two anthropologists who are very accredited in their fields, but they decide that they're going to go out into the wild and try to discover which insect, which bug, which reptile is the most painful or has the most painful bite. And so what these guys essentially do is they go towards all these different bugs, they put themselves in these scenarios, and they do exactly what you see in here. They put their hand in this big jar of bugs or reptiles, whatever it is, and they let the ants or the animal sting them, and then they rate that sting, that pain on a scale of I think 1 to 33 or whatever it may be. And the whole time the show, and half of the show, at least a little bit of what Dad showed me, is just pain. That's exactly what the title is. It's people grimacing, they're crying at different parts, they're just upset. By the way, this guy on the right, that's exactly the face I had the entire time I was watching this show. Just that kind of, what are you doing here? I don't really understand it. It's one of the most interesting and yet bizarrely weird shows I've ever seen in my life. I don't understand why my dad's into it, I don't understand why people are into it, but yet it has great ratings. But what's interesting about this show is that of all the animals, of all the bites, of all the insects, the one that scores probably in the top 5 or 6 is the harvester ants. You wouldn't think that something like that. You wouldn't think out of all the snakes and all the spiders and the scorpions and the ants and stuff like that, that a harvester ant registers one of the most painful bites of across all the animal kingdom. And yet it has something like 25 times the amount of venom as a rattlesnake has 35 times the venom of some of these other types of animals that you see. The venom and the amount of force that is inside the harvester ant is almost unmatched pound for pound in the animal kingdom. And I don't know about you, but I've never just thought about it, slowed down for a second and thought about just the pain that can come from something that little. And yet when you look at Proverbs chapter 6, if you look at Proverbs chapter 6, starting in verse 6, you can see that Solomon, for all intents and purposes, has spent a lot of time thinking about that. About how big things, about how powerful things come in small packages. And so when he says in Proverbs chapter 6, starting in verse 6, he gives advice to his hearer. You can see that through the first several chapters. He tells us, "Go to the ant, O sluggard. Observe her ways and be wise, which, having no chief officer or ruler, prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard, and when will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come in like a vagabond, and your need like an armed man." Proverbs, or Solomon talks about in Proverbs chapter 6, this idea of the ant, and he instructs us to go to the ant, to look at it, to peer into it, and try to learn lessons from it. And this isn't the only time he does this. We won't get into this. But if you look later in the book of Proverbs, right around Proverbs chapter 29 and 30, he talks about how things that are small in the earth, like the certain types of rodents, they seem small, and yet they display remarkably wise tactics. They couch themselves within hard rocks. They prepare their food in the summer like the ant does. And so what Solomon does throughout the course of the book of Proverbs is implore us to seek wisdom sometimes in the most unlikely of places. And yet what you see here in Proverbs chapter 6 is not just him discussing the nature of the ant. Go to the ant, observe it. But he says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard." And so right away what you see in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 11, is this contrast. You have the ant that displays wise tactics. You have the ant who is industrious, who is resourceful, who is responsible. And then you have the sluggard, which is one of my favorite words in the entire English language, especially as it's found in the book of Proverbs. But whereas the ant is industrious, whereas the ant is motivated, whereas the ant accomplishes things, the sluggard is the opposite. The sluggard sits there and waits for life to happen to them. The sluggard makes excuses. The sluggard lists all the reasons why they can't do something. The sluggard at the end of the day doesn't achieve anything because they haven't even taken any step in the right direction. And the thing about this is, and as we go throughout this lesson, I want you to remember this, no one ever identifies themselves as a sluggard. No one ever, as you look at the ant and the sluggard, the contrast between the two, nobody ever, as we're looking at these, will say, that's me, I'm a sluggard, or that's who I aspire to be in 2020. And yet sometimes we find ourselves like this. Sometimes we have to wake ourselves up, we have to look in the mirror and say to ourselves, I'm not as motivated as I need to be. My spirituality isn't where it should be. My life isn't where I want it to be. I'm still falling to this temptation day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And I need to do something about it. No one ever admits, no one ever says that they're a sluggard. And yet sometimes we find ourselves in that, for better or for worse. But the important point is to pull ourselves out of this. I want you to notice the contrast between the ant and the sluggard that you see so often throughout the book of Proverbs. Starting with this very simple fact, that the ant sees a goal and the sluggard seeks gratification. I wanted to put in, but I didn't have enough space on the slide, seeks short-term gratification. The ant, as it mentions there in Proverbs chapter 6, prepares her food in the summer so that when winter comes, they're prepared for it. The ant prepares their harvest when it's harvest time, so that when it's not harvest time, they can be ready for it. But the sluggard, literally, from top to bottom, the only thing they're concerned about is doing whatever is best for them right there in that moment, at that day, at that time. I love what he says in Proverbs chapter 30. Flip over to that if you want. Proverbs chapter 30, starting in verse 16, or verse 15 rather. Proverbs chapter 30, starting in verse 15. This is one of these verses that just comes screaming in mind every once in a while when you encounter a situation, when I look in the mirror, whatever the situation is. But in Proverbs chapter 30, starting in verse 15, it says, the leech has 2 daughters, give and give. I love that phrase. The leech has 2 daughters, give and give. And there are 3 things that will never be satisfied, and yet 4 that will never say enough. Those 4 things are, verse 16, Sheol and the barren womb, the earth that is never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. What he addresses in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 15 through 16, are 4 distinct things that are never satisfied. A fire, ladies and gentlemen, is never satisfied with the amount of wood that it has. It burns that wood and it desires more wood. The grave is never satisfied with the amount of bodies that are in the grave. It's never satisfied with the amount of bodies in the cemetery. It always craves more, it always needs more, it always wants more. And he talks about the sluggard in the exact same type of way, the leech in the exact same type of way. Somebody who wants to give or who wants things, who says give, 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 and yet is never, ever, according to Proverbs chapter 30, ever satisfied, or is never satisfied. That's the fundamental difference. Barring whatever else we talk about for the rest of the sermon, that's the fundamental difference between the ant and the sluggard. The ant has an end goal in mind by which they can say, I am satisfied at this point. The sluggard is literally just looking for their next kick. And that's oftentimes if you talk to people who are drug addicts, people who have some kind of addiction, across really the spectrum, that's really what it's about for them. It's not that they can't see the end goal. It's not that they don't know that there is an end goal. It's that they push that to the side for the sake of the short-term fix. And there's a whole bunch of psychology in it, and we empathize with those types of people. But people who have any kind of addiction, they push off the long-term goal in favor of that next little kick, that next hit, that next little high. And yet a sluggard is no different. A sluggard knows exactly what they need to do in life. A sluggard knows exactly what it takes to become a child of God. A sluggard knows the temptation that is in front of them, knows what the temptation is going to do to their souls, and yet for whatever reason, they push it to the side because they just want one more quick hit. That's what a sluggard does. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 4, Solomon says, the sluggard doesn't plow after the autumn, and so he begs during the harvest and has nothing. We talked about last week at length about the idea of setting goals. We won't belabor the point here, but when he says in verse 8 that she prepares her food in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest, what he's focusing on is the fact that the ant takes care of business when they have to. They don't push it off to something else. They don't say in a couple days I'll come around to it, in a couple weeks I come around to it. And that's essentially the problem with Agrippa. When Agrippa heard Paul talk about the gospel, and Acts mentions specifically that he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, which is a fantastic 3-part sermon. When he reasons about all 3 of those things, Agrippa gets terrified. He says, go away, and for a convenient time, I'll call you back. We'll talk about this more later when I'm a little bit more comfortable with you. We don't know if Agrippa ever came around to that. We don't know what eventually happened to Agrippa, spiritually speaking. But what we do know is that he chose short-term comfort over the long-term goal that he knew was there. And just to nail down that point further, Paul explicitly says to Agrippa, do you understand the Scriptures? You know what I'm talking about. And yet you're still not doing it. The sluggard, or the ant rather, values daily habits. The sluggard procrastinates. I did a lot of ant research this weekend. I thought it was kind of fun. But one of the things I learned about ants, actually it wasn't fun at all. It was actually the exact opposite of fun. One of the things I learned about ants this week is that ants have a relatively short lifespan. I didn't think about that. But in Proverbs chapter 6, when he says that the ant prepares for food in the harvest, your line of reasoning, your natural thought process is, well, eventually they're going to enjoy that harvest. And that's not always the case. The queen can sometimes live for years, can sometimes live for decades, but the worker ants, the male ants usually, have a lifespan of about a few days, a few weeks, a few months. And so when you look at that, when you think about ants, especially in terms of Proverbs chapter 6, what you see is that they're preparing for something that they may not even be able to enjoy themselves. And yet what they understand is that that future is there. What kind of future is there a decade from now hinges on what they do today. The preservation of the colony hinges on what they do today. I heard somebody say very wisely, again keeping this kind of natural metaphor, but I heard somebody say very wisely one time that the best time to ever plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. I want you to look at Proverbs chapter 24. Look back a few pages. Proverbs chapter 24. It's almost as if Solomon takes what he talks about in Proverbs chapter 6 and then zooms it several years in the future. And you have a very sober picture in Proverbs chapter 24, starting in verse 30, of the end results of this type of lifestyle. And he says in Proverbs chapter 24, starting in verse 30, I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. That's kind of a very similar idea for sluggard. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, its stone wall was broken down. And when I saw it, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction, which is what we should do when we encounter a scenario like that. I looked and I received instruction. And then he says the exact same thing that he said in chapter 6. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. Whereas an ant looks at the end goal, sees the need that needs to take place, sees what can happen in the future based on the choices they make today, an ant prepares for that. The sluggard, as we just mentioned, exchanges long-term goals for short-term gratification, but the end result of it, according to Proverbs chapter 24, is desolation. What the ant understands is that the harvest isn't brought in by one really hard day of work. A harvest of any sort is not brought in by any one little, huge, magnificent day of work. It's brought in by a bunch of little daily habits. I'm making the choice today to be a better Christian than I was yesterday. I'm making the decision today to help my church in a way that I know will benefit us 10 years down the road. Whereas the sluggard constantly says that they'll do it tomorrow. Another show of hands real quick. How many people made resolutions for January 1st? How many people made resolutions for 2020? Anybody? You don't have to tell me what the resolution was. How many people made resolutions for 2020? Wow, one person, two people. Thank you, Amelia. And that completely destroys the next part of this. Most of us start resolutions. Most of us, when we make resolutions, because I know Joe made one at least. Most of us, when we make resolutions, we plan them to start on January 1st. And you know what that eventually happens. If you plan your resolution starting in December 10th, December 13th, but you say on January 1st, I'm going to start this, and we'll pick the easiest one, dieting. We'll say on January 1st, I'm going to start this resolution. You know what that time span is going to be like between December 13th and January 1st. It's going to be filled with cakes. It's going to be filled with not exercising. It's going to be filled with a lot of TV. It's going to be filled with a lot of things that you think you won't be able to do starting on January 1st. And what you've essentially done, what I essentially do in that type of situation, is I procrastinate. I say, I'll do that later. I'll do that a week from now. I'll do that then. But I'm not going to do it now. The sluggard makes a lifestyle out of that. The sluggard always constantly understands, and this is, I think, the great deception about being a sluggard. The sluggard knows what needs to change in their life. The sluggard knows what needs to change within their spiritual life and their physical life, but they always say, I'll do it eventually. There's a fantastic study that showed that simply telling somebody about what you intend to do gives you the same emotional high as actually completing that activity. And so somebody who says, I'm going to, starting on January 1st, I'm going to lose weight, well, you've already reaped the emotional reward from that. So why should you January 1st? Bring the reward. And yet what decided, and I'll spare you the details on this, but he decided that he was going to make a change in his life, and that in order to start that change, kickstart that change, he was going to, every single time he went to the bathroom, he was going to do 2 push-ups. I'm not here to comment on where he decided to do those push-ups. He was going to do 2 push-ups every single time he went to the bathroom. Of course, in the next 6 months, he lost about 40 pounds, and not just based on the push-ups alone, but based on the daily habits that just that little thing kicked into his life. We underestimate sometimes the value of those little daily habits. Tony Robbins, like him or hate him, Tony Robbins has a fantastic quote where he says, we underestimate or we overestimate how much we can accomplish in a year, and we underestimate how much we can accomplish in a decade. There are a lot of people in this room, ladies and gentlemen, that are somewhere that they wanted to be 10 years ago. Spiritually speaking, physically speaking, whatever the situation is. But if you're not, I implore you, ladies and gentlemen, to start it today. Look at Proverbs chapter 4. I think it's very fitting when you look at, as we talked about in our Genesis class, the way that Scripture is laid out. It almost just speaks to this idea of purpose, and it speaks to intentionality. But in Proverbs chapter 4, starting in verse 20, Solomon says, my son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your sight. Keep them in the midst of your heart. For they are life to those who find them, and they are health to all their body. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you a deceitful mouth. Put devious speech far from you. Let your eyes look directly ahead. Let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right nor to the left, and do not turn your foot from evil. Very early in the book of Proverbs, Solomon sets the tone for what's eventually going to happen. In the first 3 chapters, he talks about the value of wisdom, and he talks about how its worth is far above gold, far above rubies. But starting in chapter 4, verses 20 through 27, he sets the guidelines. And everything that he says from this point out is couched within those verses. Put your eyes straight ahead. Don't turn to the right or left. Don't entertain sinners. Focus on what's important. Everything he says, ladies and gentlemen, in the book of Proverbs, from that point forward, hinges on what he says here, verses 20 through 27. Life isn't about these monumental big changes that we sometimes make, where we think, starting January 1st, my entire life's going to change. Life isn't about that any more than our spiritual life is about that. It starts with daily habits. It starts with me not saying, I'm going to memorize the entire Bible by January 2nd. It begins by me saying, January 1st, I'm going to read Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, and I'm going to spend 10 minutes thinking about what that verse means. The month of January, I'm going to isolate the temptation that I know strikes me right to my spiritual core, and I'm going to nuke that thing into oblivion. It starts with the January 1st saying, I want to this year give an invitation. I want to talk to my friend about the gospel. I want to stretch myself spiritually. I want to grow spiritually, and I'm going to take that first step. January 1st. That's the difference between the ant and the sluggard. Finally, the ant is motivated, whereas the sluggard makes excuses. I love how Solomon highlights the autonomy of the ant in Proverbs chapter 6. Because he says very specifically in that passage that the ant has no chief, has no officer or ruler, and yet just almost instinctively, or just because they have that goal in mind, they know it's important, they go out and do it anyways. The ant is motivated. The ant sees the goal, the ant sees the need, and then he works to fill that need. And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly where we're at in our life. We talk about all the time about how the only person that will stand before God and give an account for your life is you. It's me. And so if I'm standing before God thinking someday, or I'm sitting here right now thinking to myself someday that Paul, Shell, and Cody are going to vouch for me on the day of judgment, or because Travis just loves me so much that he's going to stand before God and say, yeah, I know there were some issues, but man, what a great guy Ray was. We are fooling ourselves into eternal condemnation. The only people that will, the only person that will give an account for your life in the day of judgment is you. And so it behooves you this day, right now, this moment, to think about where you're at spiritually. This church is going through an amazing time right now. This church is going through a period of growth. It's going through a vibrant period of energy. I love where we're at right now at Hillside, but where are we going to be at, ladies and gentlemen, 10 years from now? The church on Pentecost grew in Jerusalem from 120 some odd people to almost 5,000 people within the span of 2 or 3 chapters there. And yet the church in Jerusalem right now sits at about 80 people. What happened over the last 2,000 years? Where'd that energy go? Where'd that zeal go? Where'd that drive go? What happened to that church? What's going to happen to this church 10 years from now? I'll tell you right now what's going to happen to this church 10 years from now. What's going to happen to this church 10 years from now is based on the decisions that you and I, that we make right now, today, in 2020. Proverbs chapter 26. This is a hilarious section. I love it. And I hate it at the same time because I can see myself kind of in it. Proverbs chapter 26, starting in verse 12. Notice how he bookends this verse in this section. Proverbs chapter 26, starting in verse 12. He says, do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. We all know this type of person. We all interact with this type of person. Sometimes we even are this person. Verse 13, the sluggard says there's a lion in the road. A lion is in the open square. It's not really a lion. As the door turns on its hinges, so the sluggard does on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He is weary of bringing it to his mouth again because he's been on a 12-hour Netflix hike where he's been getting some Cheetos and Pepsi for the last 12 hours. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He's weary of bringing it back to his mouth again. The sluggard, verse 16, is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer. You know the most frustrating part about dealing with either the sluggard that we know or the sluggard inside of us? Is that the reason that we're sluggard in the first place is because it makes perfect sense to us. You can't argue with somebody who spends all day on their bed. You can't argue with them that it's better for them to get out and get a job or to work for a living because after all, who wants to get out of bed? Of course it makes sense. Of course it's comfortable. Of course it's cozy. That's not the point. The ant understands that if the future is not secure, the present is not comfortable. And the sluggard makes excuses for everything. They say, well, there's a lion in the street. Can't do that today. I'm going to turn on my bed like a door on its hinges. It's just commonplace. It just happens. And so you can't argue with somebody who sees the wisdom in their own eyes of their own inactivity because in their mind it makes perfect sense. Why would I work when I can be at ease? That's the argument that the sluggard makes to themselves. The other slothfulness the sluggard is laid out in spectacular display. Listen to what he says in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 25. Solomon says, the soul of the sluggard puts him to death, for his hands refuse to work. I want to read that again. The soul of the sluggard puts him to death, for his hands refuse to work. Not can't work, not is unable to work, not doesn't have the right skills to work. The hand or the sluggard refuses to work. So I want to ask you a question as we finish this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Which one am I? I thought about putting which one are you, but that would seem too out there. So I want to look at myself too. Spiritually speaking, which one am I? Am I thinking about my life, spiritually speaking, and happy with it? Or do I always see changes? Am I always progressing to work on myself spiritually? Am I helping to build this church up spiritually in the way that I know we need to go? Am I a spiritual sluggard or a spiritual ant in terms of Bible study? In terms of prayer, in terms of evangelism, in terms of self-discipline, in terms of fellowship? Am I a spiritual ant? Or am I a spiritual sluggard? I want you to look at Romans chapter 12 as we finish. Romans chapter 12 is both exhortative in that it pushes us forward, but it also gives us a little bit of liberty. Romans chapter 12. Starting in verse 3. And if this doesn't sound like Solomon with Proverbs, I don't know what does. Verse 3, for though the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. He could stop there and that'd give me enough to work on for the rest of this year. But to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each one of them a measure of faith. For just as we have many members in one body, and all the members don't have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. So since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith. If service, in his serving, and he who teaches in his teaching, or he who exhorts in his exhortation, or he who gives with liberality, or he who leads with diligence, or he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. God does not expect you to do something or that which you are incapable of doing. But what he does expect you to do is to make the most of what he has given to you. And I would be willing to bet that if each one of us looked inside ourselves spiritually and thought to ourselves, how can I stretch myself this year? How can I grow? We may think to ourselves that we are at this point, that we can only go so far. But I'd be willing to bet that we should go a little bit further. That I can go spiritually farther than I used to. Barriers that I thought existed. I don't want to talk to my friend because it's scary. I can't pray in public, which, maybe I don't want to do that for whatever reason. Whatever that situation is, that should be be one that barrier is put in place by yourself and is not really there. God doesn't expect you to do something that you're incapable of doing, but He does expect you to stretch yourself, to use the gifts that you have. Verse 9, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. And I love how he finishes off with this, contributing to the needs of the saints and practicing hospitality. How can you serve the Lord better in 2020? How can I serve the Lord better in 2020? How can we as a church serve the Lord better in 2020? Are we going to be spiritual ants? Or are we going to be spiritual servants? Ultimately, we'll give an account for whatever decision we make in the day of judgment. But that decision is made and is continued to make daily. So if you're here this morning and you're apart from God, the only decision that you really need to make at this point is whether or not you want to put Him on through the waters of baptism. Whether or not you're ready to take that step, to move into the family of God, to wash away your sins, to rise and walk in newness of life, and be an active contributing partner to the work going on at Hillside and to the work going on in the broader kingdom of God. Is that what you want to do this morning? I would encourage you, if you need to do that, and do it.